Hello, YouTube, and welcome back to Artist Autopsy, the show where we dissect artists, musicians, creators, and all sorts of other people to analyze their content and their artistry in general. Today, I want to talk about the name on everybody's lips, Taylor Swift. And I know it's a well-worn topic. People talk about her all the time in either raving ways or disparaging ways. And that's the vibe you normally get from people, is that they either love Taylor or they hate Taylor. I, from my perspective, am only most aware of her famous songs that have been played on the radio constantly and some of the relationship drama that's happened over the years. But for the most part, I've kept a distance from Taylor. She just doesn't seem like my kind of music. I am going into this process thinking that she's a relatively generic artist. But I said, you know what? That's not fair. Let me do my own assessment. That's what autopsy means originally, is to look for oneself. So I plan on doing that. I am going to be looking at one Taylor album every single day and see what we can kind of glean from it. The main thesis of this video is I want to figure out what the special sauce is. I want to know what people like about her, what keeps people so obsessed, and similarly, why there's such a disconnect in between the people that love her and the people who don't. And just a quick note, I'll only be listening to the main version of all of her albums. She does a lot of re-recordings and extended versions of her albums, but I really wanted to get a feeling for a different snapshot of each Taylor era, and I felt that could be best done by looking at the core version of each album by itself. Also, as a newbie to the Taylor Swift world, I am undoubtedly going to get some things wrong. So please forgive me. I don't mean this as any personal offense towards Taylor or any attempt to diminish her fame, which I don't think I could even if I tried. But that is not the goal. I am just curious because I have a lot of friends who really like Taylor Swift, and I never really got it, and I want to figure out why that is. So, with that out of the way, let's see if I, Nick North, become a Swift. So, we start with day one. Her self-titled album. This album is her first, and I'm sure as many of you know, it's a very country-centric outing. From this era, her most famous songs that I was aware of prior to this project were Teardrops on My Guitar and Our Song. Now, something to remember about this time frame is for country as a genre, it was a very different feel than the country music of the past, such as like Johnny Cash, Dolly Parton, and also a very different feel from like the current renaissance of country music, which has Orville Peck, Trixie Mattel, and most recently, of course, Beyonce. Basically, this era that we'll be focusing on, that this album came out in, is the kind of music that they play at like Longhorn or Texas Roadhouse. It has the air of country, but it's made for commercial audiences. And for me, the heart of country music should be raw hardship and rural heartache that inspires the best of the genre. And I won't necessarily fault Taylor for this, but at this time in history, the majority of country music had a more like poppy feeling, and there was an overall loss of genuinity to the songs of this era. I would title this era as the Red Solo Cup era, where artists were more obsessed with trucks, beer, and cute people than like the loneliness, poverty, and heartache that made some of the great country stars so relatable. And I can't say I'm terribly surprised when the market that they were going for was teenage girls who listened to this kind of country music, which I can say from personal experience are the people in this world with the least perspective on hardship. I'm sorry, dear. I just don't know how much longer we're going to be able to pay the bills. My mining job got cut. We have to pay for your grandpa's funeral. And I can't keep buying you the same clothes that you're used to. I'm sorry. But Dad, you don't understand. She wears short shorts. I wear t-shirts. That's our whole thing. I need the t-shirts. For me, that level of naivete kind of permeates the first album, along with the sort of faux country feel that I was talking about, with it having more of a generic feel, and I'm excited for that departure that I've heard is coming from like my friends who are giant Taylor fans. In a way, I see this album as a necessary stepping stone for Taylor to get into the public eye, but I don't think it holds up that well by itself. It's relatively common, especially in pop music, for the first few albums of a discography to be kind of like figuring out what the sound of the artist is, because it's underdeveloped. Your artist is normally young, new, sometimes they don't have a super poignant perspective, and you kind of want to keep it open just in case that perspective changes over time. Overall, I would rate this album a 4 out of 10, which I assume will be the lowest on this list, but we'll see. Alrighty, on to day 2. We have Fearless. Fearless is the second album and the first, chronologically speaking, to get a re-recording. At this point in her life, Taylor was dating the other Taylor. No, not that one, as much as I would love it. This Taylor, experiencing a lot of accolades and a very famous interruption by Kanye West, who is best known for not shutting the fuck up ever since. This album is still plagued by some of the faux country sound of the first album, but around the halfway mark, there starts to become a much harder sound, and you start to get the first inklings of the songwriting that Taylor has since become famous for. A specific shout out to the song The Best Day, which, although not the catchiest song on the album, it was the first of Taylor's so far to really strike any kind of emotional chord with me. Overall, I don't have a ton to say about this album. It is not my favorite, not terrible. I think it's an excellent example, however, of something that we'll see going forward, which is a lot of the songs on the album are about love and relationships, and I think this is where she started to get the moniker of boy obsessed or man eater and all of this stuff. But I'll get into that later because it is an aspect of her songwriting that does not go away. Overall, I would rate this a 5 out of 10 for slight improvement over the previous album. It's day 3, and we're on Speak Now. And at this point in the process, I was beginning to lose hope in the process or the project at all, because Speak Now has the same gripes that I have with the first two, and sometimes even goes above and beyond to do it to a higher degree. The songwriting is certainly better, don't get me wrong, but the main takeaway from the album is how badly her songs need a different sound change. Many of the songs on this album could easily fit into either of the prior two with no discernible difference. Overall, it's slow, but it's still too, sweet and saccharine to really feel the heartbreak that she's hypothetically talking about. The more you get into the album, the more attempts at experimentation you can find, dipping into a more of a rock pop genre. But because of the ordering of the tracks, it feels like they aren't really sure what direction they're going in and what direction the album is supposed to have overall, which is kind of frustrating because, if the goal is to show Taylor's transition as an artist, what I would do personally, not that I'm some fucking music producer or whatever, but I think I would start with the more country sound and then slowly transition into the more rock sound. But instead, it kind of feels like two sides of a conversation that aren't listening to each other because it just keeps bouncing back and forth. As I grow older, I really love green tea. How's your dad's cancer? I know, right? It goes so well with everything. Oh no, I'm so sorry to hear that. It might just be my new favorite thing. If you need someone to watch the kids while you go identify the body, I can. It's just frustrating as a listener, retrospectively, to see the lack of direction that they had with Taylor's music at this time. It's clear that change needs to happen, so for this album, I'll give it a 3 out of 10 for lack of improvement. Day 4. And change it did. On day 4, we have Red, which is one of her more famous albums. And I can't explain how much of a breath of fresh air Red is compared to its previous siblings. It has a point of view, it has heart, and damn if I say it has some very catchy songs. I was pleasantly surprised listening to this one after the previous 3, and I'm finally starting to see the potential of her as an artist, with the kind of lyrics that people rave about when it comes to her music finally coming to the forefront. This album displays a much more pop-centric vibe for Taylor, which I do think is the correct choice, especially at this point in her career. As we see with like the future songs that we're aware of from Taylor, it obviously worked out well for her. There's still a bit too much centered on her love life for my liking, but it works so much better because of the variety of experiences that she's talking about, rather than just the butterfly feelings of new love that we see covered on the first 3 albums. This album begins to explore the depths of heartbreak, romantic experience, and although it has a long way to go, it is the first taste of the greater artistic vision, and the first album I can say that I genuinely enjoyed listening to. So overall, I would give the album a 7 out of 10, which is the best so far, and I'm excited for it to keep getting better, hopefully. Also, this is the era that Taylor Swift voiced a character in the Lorax, whose main interests include her love interest Ted, being with Ted, and trees. Day 5. 1989. Overall, I'd say so far this is her most generic pop album so far, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because there are some memorable hits from this album, such as Shake It Off, Blank Space, and Bad Blood. This album's hard for me. I feel 2 different ways about it. It was obviously the right choice to do an album like this based on her music trajectory, because they want to reach as wide of an audience as possible to like capitalize on her success. But there isn't as much raw emotional energy as there was on Red. And given that that's the best example of Taylor that I've seen so far, I do find 1989 a bit of a letdown, especially because the best songs have been overplayed on the radio so much that instead of experiencing the highs of the album, I just kind of re-listened to overplayed songs that I've heard a million times. And that's not necessarily Taylor's fault, obviously, but you know, I can't act like it didn't affect my listening of 1989. Luckily, we do see some differentiation of song material, with Bad Blood famously being like a fuck you track to Katy Perry, supported by a music video where Taylor Swift shows off all of her lifelong best acquaintances, and prompts Katy Perry to make Swish Swish and the accompanying music video, which features the Mountain from Game of Thrones in a singlet. So for that, Taylor, I thank you. Overall, I would give this album a 6.5 out of 10. I didn't hate it. It is a step down from Red, but let's see. Let's see how the trends go. Day 6. Reputation. Reputation. Such an odd album for me. This is the closest from like a marketing and single perspective that Taylor has to like a villain era, which is pretty effective for most of the album, as it strikes a good balance between like that persona and the actual meat of the album. It's nice to see some different content exploring her fame, but at some points it does border on cringy, specifically Look What You Made Me Do, which caused my ears to bleed. I feel like it needs to be said, Taylor is not a threatening person, or fearsome, or scary. I'm not worried about her coming to get me or whatever, in the way that like Nicki Minaj might beat your ass, but Taylor Swift just isn't going to, and that's okay. I don't think that should be what she's trying to go for. There's this perception of in Hollywood of like going through a heel phase or a villain arc as a way to be taken seriously, and in some cases it can be satisfying for listeners because you are finally clapping back against the criticism you're getting, or you're showing a stronger side of yourself. But in other cases, like Taylor, or with more recently JoJo Siwa, it just comes off as a bad Halloween costume because your brand and your marketing doesn't really have anything to do with like being strong and threatening in that same way. Like it would make more sense to go in the direction that your brand is already going in than trying to do this weird like flip turn just to change people's perceptions of you, which honestly are like pretty solid at this point. Like Reputation is her 6th album, and I think most people have probably already figured out how they feel about Taylor Swift, besides me, of course, who was under a rock during this time. And that rock is called depression. Seeing as this is the last of like the Big Machines Records albums, I'm excited for this era to end. And although these last albums have been a vast improvement over the first 3, they still aren't bringing me any closer to figuring out like what it is that is the special sauce to Taylor Swift. Also, as a side note, Big Machine Records couldn't sound more like an evil corporation solely pumping out pop music if they tried. Which is fair, because that's exactly what they fucking are. Overall, the album itself is relatively generic, and I hate to keep using that word, but it's very obvious that that was the goal of this album. And the marketing team was to say, like, with 1989, they basically said, here is Taylor in her full version. Here's the pop artist that you've been looking for. And then Reputation is saying to, like, the teenage girls at the time, like, and also, she's an adult that you should take seriously. So, overall, I would say 6 out of 10. Not terribly impressed. Day 7. Lover. Overall, this album is a nice debut for the Neo-Taylor era. It has the kind of late, airy quality that you would expect based on the album art, but overall I was surprised to see that I was emotional at Soon You'll Get Better, and very entranced by It's Nice to Have a Friend. I do want to touch on If I Was a Man for a second, because it's clear at this point that Taylor was feeling like her being a woman was held against her, and for a good amount of criticism, I would absolutely agree. I think that, especially when we talk about her love life and the kind of string of partners she had, the reputation that she has gotten is unfair. I do think that men would not experience the same amount of criticism as shown by many male artists, including Leonardo DiCaprio, Shawn Mendes, other people kind of in this genre. At the end of the day, some men and even some women hate seeing women succeed, and that's a real shame. And that's not what I want to do with this video. From my perspective with this video, I'm trying my best to kind of hold her male contemporaries up to the same criticisms. I think a good match from the male gender to kind of talk about the same themes and problems that I have is Ed Sheeran. Because subject material is pretty similar. Overuse of marketability over substance is also a similar thing, at least in this point in their careers. Ed Sheeran is another one that I wouldn't mind covering just because I haven't really delved super far into him. But I do think, from my perspective, it is true that there are men who I have the same criticism for that I do for Taylor. And I wish more people felt the same way. And I think it's a shame that she has to deal with this. But with that out of the way, overall, I think this album has a lot more to enjoy than a lot of her older ones. It has a different vibe, it explores different instruments and different sounds, and even has an air of like freedom about it that is much more enjoyable than I was predicting going into this review. If the whole album was the same quality of Soon You'll Get Better, Me, and Nice to Have a Friend, I would rank this very highly, but as it stands, I would still give it a solid 8 out of 10. Day 8. Speaking of 8, on day 8 we have Folklore, and it's a bit of a somber time, but not in a bad way. Folklore evokes heartache, depression and loss. It came out during the pandemic, so that's a vibe that you can see throughout the album. That feeling of like isolation and confusion about like what's going to happen. The sound of the album kind of reminded me of Lizzie McAlpin and similar, more like folksy artists, which I think was obviously the goal based on the title. It's thoughtful, it's melancholy, and it's unabashedly full of longing. Betty specifically, as well as the earlier parts of the album's love story, are so invoking of that age of 17, where all of the flawed character traits and bad ideas are on full display, matched with that, like, fuck it attitude, because, like, you're young, you physically don't have the ability to think otherwise. This album is by far my favorite, because of the storyline, the vibes, and the rawness that I have rarely seen from Taylor up to this point. I'm finally getting the type of vulnerability that informs her worldview, rather than just the worldview itself, and that's really nice to see. Hoax, the last song on the album, is a beautiful ending to this outing, giving a send-off to the forlorn narrator with a pessimistic but insightful view into what the world was at the time that this album came out. Overall, I would give this a 9 out of 10. I was very impressed. Day 9! Evermore. Evermore is like Folklore's little sister. It's even confirmed that they have ties to each other, and because of that reason, it's going to be a little bit of a shorter review, because you can just copy and paste a lot of the stuff from before. It has a similar tone, without some of the maturity and perspective that Folklore had, in my opinion. That's not to say that there aren't some good songs on here. There certainly are, but at its worst, it harkens back to the issues I had in the earlier albums, with it trying to evoke country sensibilities without seeming to like kind of have the experience or ability to do so. I think a great example of this is the song Cowboy. Also, at its best, it's a collaboration or advertisement for other artists like The National and Bon Iver, which is great for them. But if the best songs on the album are collaborations with other people, that's not always the best sign. Overall, kind of a step down, but not a bad album. Like I said, it's like the little sister. Like, she just needs to do some figuring out in her life first, and then she'll be right up there with the greats. Day 10. Midnights. The album Midnights. What happened to Folklore Taylor? She's dead. This album feels like a sequel to Red in terms of tone. And I won't lie to you guys. 10 albums into this review, and I'm kind of getting exhausted with the sheer amount of Taylor songs that are about guys she's dated, loved. Like, let's get the good stuff out of the way. Karma is an amazing song. It's catchy, it's poppy, and it's fun. But, like, other than that, oof. Taylor is 34. So my question is, why are we writing songs about your friends making fun of you and wearing friendship bracelets? It honestly sometimes borders on like Arrested Development, where I wonder if Taylor is capable of getting out of this mentality and life perspective. Because at the 10th album, my main question remains, like, who is Taylor Swift? Like, what are her hobbies? What are her thoughts on life in general? And there are many times when she'll, like, scrape the surface of these topics, but it's kind of clear what her focus is always on. And it's normally on love. And if it's not about love, it's getting back at somebody, like we saw with Bad Blood, or vigilante shit, which has the exact same energy as the more recent Karma by JoJo Siwa. Like, and I know I talked about this earlier, but I get so frustrated with the, like, fake bad girl thing. Like, going on and on about, like, revenge or being a mastermind. Like, what does that even mean when you are Taylor Swift? Is she going to write a song about me? Because it kind of feels like she was going to anyway. And I want to point out that from a writing perspective, I tried to make other jokes in this area, but I can't even joke about what her revenge would be, because that's how little I know about her. That's how little she's shown who she is outside of the dynamic of a relationship. I would say for this one, honestly, 4 out of 10. It was a big letdown after Folklore and even after Evermore. Day 11. The Tortured Poets Department. We've reached the end of our journey, and I think I finally have an answer to my question. We'll get into that in a second during the conclusion, but I want to express my thoughts on TTPD first. It's fine. Which I know is kind of a letdown for the last album, but it does some of the good things that Folklore did well, but without some of the heart. I think part of my mediocre reception to this album is just the fatigue at all of the similarities that I've seen between the Taylor albums over this process. And it's not a bad album. Like, I think if I had listened to it in the actual time span that it came out, meaning, like, if it had been 2 years since the last Taylor album that I listened to, maybe I would rank it higher, but that's not the goal of this. The goal is to look at the variety and the perspective that an artist's body of work can give. And for that, I don't think TTPD is the best outing. It's not a bad album at all, but it's also not super groundbreaking. I've heard these sounds from her, I've heard these feelings from her, and it's kind of like having a family tradition that is just kind of okay. Like, it's cute. Like, I enjoy doing it because, like, it's a tradition, but I've done it before, and so it loses the magic a little bit for me. Day 12. All right, so that was a roller coaster. Some highs, some lows, some in-betweens. Oh yeah, and also a stipulation, you're not allowed to get mad at me for my Taylor opinions. You're just not. So hope you're okay with that. So let's get to the bottom of it. What is the reason for her popularity among such a passionate group of people? Why do some people not get it? Why did I not get it earlier? What is there to gain from this, to garner from this? I've alluded to it earlier in the video, but the vast majority, some calculations even saying like easily over 70%, depending on your interpretation of some songs, is about love, breakups, or relationships. In researching this video and kind of getting a beat on the general feelings towards Taylor Swift, it's clear that a lot of her detractors use the idea of it all being breakup songs as the reason for not liking the artist, and there is some understandable debunking of that from hardcore Taylor fans saying, no, it's actually not all about breakups, you know, she's not this like toxic man-eater. And I would actually agree with that. I think the detracting perspective about her would say that she's doing this on purpose, that she's toxic, or that she's using men just so she can get song lyrics and stuff. And I don't think that's the case. However, the absolutely undeniable fact is that if you largen the scope to not just include breakups, but also love, relationships, feelings about boys, you know, reminiscing about old relationships, the large majority of her discography covers that one topic. And don't get me wrong, she's covered it in depth and sometimes beautifully. But it's like, the allegory I would use is like, imagine if someone was trapped in like their bedroom for their entire life and they just kept writing notes about it. Of course, when you first look at the journal, such as like her first self-titled album, basically what you're going to see is someone describing the walls, the objects in the room on a very surface level, kind of the general layout. Similar to how Taylor is talking about butterfly feelings and first love for the first time. And then you get to red, where you start hearing about all of the different colors of the objects and the textures and all of the details of all of the giant things in the room, right? And that's really exciting because it brings like a vibrancy to the room that you didn't realize was there before. And then when you get to folklore and evermore, it feels like someone's describing how everything feels, like how the blanket feels, how the wall texture is, how they even emotionally feel about these things, how the colors of these things make them feel, how it brings certain things to mind. And you're like, wow, this is like really insightful stuff about this like room that I've become familiar with because of you telling me about all of this stuff. And then at a certain point, we get to Midnights or TTPD, where she's going into like the individual like fibers of the carpet. And you're like, all right, like I don't know if I need to know about like the names that you gave to every single like shred of a blanket. Do you know what I mean? Like, I hope that makes sense. And if you get to a point where you're describing like the individual placement of every speck of dust in the room, while I still love the beauty of the earlier descriptions, I think I'm left with this question of like, why are you stuck in the room? And how beautiful would your descriptions of other rooms in the house be? And to get it out of metaphor land for a second, like, why does everything have to be about relationships? Like, why can't we hear about like your thoughts about being like a 34-year-old woman? Like fucking Jenna Marbles always used to say. And it just, I think when you go so fully detailed into one aspect, people start to wonder like why you don't have all the other aspects. Who is Taylor outside of the dynamic of someone else? And I think why certain people don't get it is because, if we're going back to the room analogy, they've never been in that room before. They don't understand the familiar feelings, the familiar position that you were in. They don't understand the kind of experiences that you've had in that room. But also, the reason why people are so passionate and love this content so much is because they have been in this room before. At times, they will revisit this room when they listen to one of Taylor's albums. I think that's one of the benefits of it, is that it harkens back to that shared experience that they've all had. But I think for Taylor, it's kind of sad, no? Like, other people get to revisit the room all the time, but it kind of feels like Taylor's stuck there. I think people find her relatable because of the time in their own lives that she symbolizes. But thinking about Taylor as a person from an artistic level, it feels like that time has kind of paused. And I think that's a bit of a shame. I was consulting one of my friends who's a Swiftie about this, and she was kind of saying that she hopes that TTPD is the sign of like a break or like a new era, because I think, especially if you look, like, I'm not kidding, guys, like the sheer amount of music that Taylor puts out is staggering, like way more than you think that she does. And on some levels that's really impressive, but also from one artist to another, like, you've just got to give yourself time to have new experiences to make art about. You can't just keep making art constantly, or else your well is going to run dry. And so that's what I hope for her as well. Because I do think that she has some potential. I do think that she's a very insightful person, but I want to see that applied to other stuff. And I think that's a fair want from any artist, is to see their perspective on the world. Overall, I think I've cracked the case, but I want to know what your thoughts are on it, obviously, and who I should cover next. I appreciate you all for watching this video among all the other ones on this fucking platform. And thanks for everything. See you guys in the next one.